Okay.
My name is Anirudh Ravikumar. On Team Proposition, we stand before you, asking you to look into the eyes of Nirbhaya's parents and tell them that their daughter, who was brutally raped and eventually died, will receive no justice because the person who raped her had 6 months away to go from an arbitrary number. We ask you to look into their eyes and tell them that their daughter, who was brutally murdered, will not face any justice, but instead what will happen is that her murderer and her rapist will be allowed with a slap on the wrist of 3 years at a reform center. We simply don't accept that on Team Proposition. We tell you that justice should prevail because age is just a number. So what do we propose on Team Proposition today? So firstly we say that we will be prosecuting people who are 13 years and above as in this policy as adults. We say that we will, by prosecuting them as adults in criminal cases, what we mean is that we will have the same sort of process that we use for adults. We will have the same type of sentencing, etc. However, we would like to point out that what we will do is up until that they reach the age of 18, we think that we are fair in saying that they will be put in a separate juvenile prison, because we think that we while we want to provide justice towards the victims and their families, we don't want them to be put in a violent environment, and therefore we think that that's a distinction that we will be making in today's debate. So 4 arguments from Team Proposition in today's debate. Firstly, why we think the arbitrary distinction between minor and adult is morally bankrupt, and why we think victims have a right to compensation. Secondly, why we think how we better deter juvenile crime and better allow for rehabilitation on our side of the house. Chaitanya will be talking to you about, firstly, why parents now have an active incentive to better get involved in parenting and prevent their children from getting into crime. And lastly, why we think this increases the public faith in the criminal justice system and why that reform is better. So firstly, why we think the arbitrary distinction between a minor and an adult is morally bankrupt. So firstly, we argue that in a criminal case, you mainly look at 2 things, right? You look at the intent and you look at the action. And we say that setting a number that at 18 years you will be prosecuted as an adult is an arbitrary number that you just choose, right? We think that's a number that has no physical or psychological significance. We think that's a number that doesn't represent anything, and we think that that is a number that simply it was chosen with no moral background. We think that that's an arbitrary number that is chosen, right? We think that that doesn't account for the fact that the people who have committed these violent crimes often have an intent to commit these crimes anyway. We think it's unfair to think that just because a person is 15 years old, that he didn't want to kill that person that he killed. We think that that person still had that intent and still carried out that action. We think that the age of 18 is an arbitrary number to decide that person shouldn't get any punishment for the same, right? And secondly, more importantly, moving on to the point of the victims, right? Firstly, we say that we think that the fact that often the victims of these crimes are other children or other people that these people punish, right? But often what happens in the status quo is that these people who have committed these crimes are treated as the victims in the status quo. That is something we simply don't accept on our side of the house. We believe that if they have committed these crimes, they have to take punishment for what they've done, right? And so we believe that the state has a duty, a far greater duty, to provide redressal towards the victims of these crimes, right? We think it's abhorrent to suggest that these people will get absolutely no redressal simply because of the fact that the person who committed that crime happened to be 3 months away from some arbitrary number that the state had decided. I'll take you in a minute. And therefore, we think that ultimately, because the purpose of the criminal justice system is to provide redressal to the victims and make sure the person who perpetrated a crime is punished for their actions, we believe that this number, which is arbitrary, shouldn't get in the way of justice for victims. But before I move on to my second argument,
Just very quickly, you've constantly talked about arbitrary number 18. However, it is also this arbitrary number 18 which we use to determine so many other rights and freedoms, such as the freedom to drink or the freedom to vote. So why don't you think it's such an arbitrary number at the end of the day?
Yeah, so we agree that at a point you have to choose an arbitrary number for all those things like voting and drinking, etc. Right? What we think is the difference in this case is because it's a balance of rights between the victim's right to redressal and the right of the person who is being punished. We think that at that point where you tell the victim that you will get no redressal on the basis of some completely immoral number that has no significance at all, we think that is something that you simply cannot do, and the redressal is something you simply cannot deny based on that arbitrary number. That's the difference we think on our side of the house. Moving on to my second argument, why we think this better deters juvenile crime and better allows for the rehabilitation of these people. So we think the major problem in the status quo is that these teenagers who commit these crimes have absolutely no deterrence towards committing these crimes. Right? We think these teenagers in the status quo often have very little to no punishments for the crimes they've been doing, even if the crimes are on the same level as crimes committed by adults. And furthermore, we think that prosecutors have significant disincentives towards punishing these teenagers because the media hounds them, because the media continues to treat these people as the victims of this case when they're the perpetrators of the crime. Therefore, we think that in the criminal justice system as it stands today, there is a systematic problem that means that these people continue to have absolutely no deterrence towards committing these crimes. Right? And therefore, we think it leads to the problem of these people continuing to commit these crimes. Like we see that in the status quo, the current rates of juvenile recidivism is close to 54%. These people commit these crimes, they're sent to reform centers where they're given a slap on the wrist. They come back and they continue to commit these crimes over and over again. Right? We think that's a fundamental problem on our side, in the status quo, because we believe that we need to ensure these people firstly are deterred from committing these crimes, but secondly, we need to make sure that these people are actually rehabilitated in the process of this punishment and therefore don't continue committing these crimes over and over again. So firstly, why do we think that deterrence is better on our side of the house? We think deterrence is better on our side of the house simply because of the fact that we're going to punish these people now on a far greater scale than we will be punishing them. They no longer have the ability to think that they won't be punished and they'll be let aside simply because of the fact that they're teenagers. We think that in of itself will mean that the rates of these people committing these crimes and their intent to commit these crimes will definitely drop to a much lower extent, and therefore we think that that's why we think that deterrence works much better on our side of the house. But secondly, right, to the point of rehabilitation. So as we've already told you in our model, right, we think that until the point of 18, we think these people, teenagers, should be put in a special juvenile prison. Right? So we think that how does that work? Right? We think how that helps them is that in the current status quo, you send them to reform centers or you send them to do community service where there's absolutely no reflection of the crime that they're committing, where they're told by the criminal justice system that they can do whatever they want and they will not be punished for their actions. And therefore, we think that does nothing to rehabilitate these people. They continue to commit these crimes. However, on our side of the house, we tell you that we teach them, and we tell them that they will be punished for the crimes that they're committing and that they will be punished if they continue to do so. We give them the ability to reflect on their crimes by putting them in prisons instead of giving them a slap on the wrist and not doing anything to do anything to them. We think when you put them in these prisons, you give them the time to reflect on the actions that they're committing, reflect on the fact that they shouldn't continue to commit these actions, and therefore you give them the ability to rehabilitate, something that simply doesn't happen in the status quo. And therefore, we argue that better helps us on our side of the house to ensure firstly that these people don't, through the argument we've shown that these people won't commit these crimes in the first place because they're deterred from doing so. But secondly and more importantly, the people who commit these crimes in the status quo will be properly rehabilitated, and we will ensure that they don't continue to commit these crimes over and over again simply because of a technicality, because they were born a certain period before a certain crime was committed. So we on Sime Proposition would like to end this by telling you firstly that as we've shown you in this debate, it's an arbitrary number that decides whether a victim gets redressal or not. We think that's completely unfair. Secondly, we think we need to better them and better rehabilitate them. We are proud to propose.
Opposition side. Panel, imagine the teenager, an age where you want something thrilling, where you haven't really reached maturity, so you want to do something fun with your friends. And imagine the teenager going and say doing some petty theft, say shoplifting. The harms of this crime are pretty unreal, pretty insignificant. But the taboo of being a convicted criminal that rises from it is very much real. Your life is going to be about that one single crime you committed when you were 15 and when you were having fun with your friends. Your job will be denied to you because you have a criminal record. Your education will have problems. You will not be able to go to college because you have a criminal record. They have insignificant crimes but very real, non-existent futures. Criminal justice should aim at rehabilitation and proportionality, not vengeance. That is the principle we support on Proposition. Before moving on to my constructives, few pieces of rebuttal. First, the characterization of what crimes you commit when you're 13 years old, right? Like, you don't commit rape or murder. The crime rates in the US, for example, for committing disorderly behavior is 5,000% high as compared to the crime rates for rape. It is not you being a murderer when you're 14, but you simply doing something like through graffiti when you're 15, right? The kind of crimes that they're talking about has been very much narrow and a mischaracterization of the actual situation. Second, let's look at their model
on that point.
No, thank you. Their model point about having separate juvenile prisons. What this actually indicates is a concession that there is a unique scope for rehabilitation when you are a teenager, because your ideals have not solidified yet, you're still young. There is a unique scope for rehabilitation that you sacrifice when you send them to prison. Third, let's look at their pseudo argument about rehabilitation, right? Let's just compare the two worlds. In our world, when they go to a juvenile school and do things like community service, where they get education, vocational training and job opportunities and ability to reflect upon their crime and understand and regret what they did through therapy sessions, rather than their world where dysfunctional prisons, where prisons have poor structural conditions, which means that there are disease outbreaks in prisons, drug outbreaks in prisons, high rates of violence. This is where you are corrupt. This is where you are, where even if you did commit some heinous crime and go to prison, this is where the scope of rehabilitation is compromised. You go there, and that is when you are more harmed. Fourth, let's look at their point about the current age being arbitrary, right? First, we think that's simply false because it's already widely recognized as the age of mental maturity. That's why you can't vote, you can't marry until you're 18. But you can't just say that it's okay for the age to be lesser for some things and not less for some other things. Their case is based on a mischaracterization. What do we support? We support the status quo where we concentrate more on rehabilitation, on making you regret your crime and move past it to be an active and contributing citizen. I have three arguments for you. First, what is the standard for criminal prosecution? Why do teenagers not fall into this? Second, why they set a dangerous precedent? Third, why it is particularly dangerous for drug-related offences. Moving on to my first constructive argument. What is the standard for criminal prosecution? Why do teenagers not fall under this? Culpability, ladies and gentlemen, requires intent. For intent to be legitimate and to be used in a criminal justice system, you need to have some amount of maturity, some amount of active desire to do
on that point, sir.
In an age of, when you're a teenager, when you have peer pressure, when you have this inherent idea to rebel, this hormonal imbalance, it is clearly not active intent. Peer pressure makes you do things like drugs or vandalism. Thrill makes you go into a bar fight when you're 16, or you just get into crimes like bullying that just escalate into a quick fight and you get convicted for assault or battery on their side of the house, right? We tell you these are not actual intent, but the consequences of their conviction is very much so. Besides, studies clearly suggest that it's from 18 to 22 when the brain development is at maximal level, and prosecuting teenagers before that is simply ridiculous. Second, proportionality of punishment.
On that point,
there is no active intent to commit a crime, and when there is this teen factor that I've explained, we tell you punishment has to accommodate this and has to be proportional, which cannot be done on their side of the house. I'll take it.
So, why does a person who's 17 years and 8 months old have no intent, whereas a person who's 18 has all the intent?
Okay, this case cannot be won on a technicality, right? You have to show us why it is principally just for you to reduce the age from 18 to 13. 13 when you're still playing Call of Duty with your friends and want to try it in real life, and 18 when you are mature enough to have some basic intent. Third point, scope for rehabilitation. When you're young and have not formed your ideals, your basic principles yet, you have clearly much more scope for rehabilitation than a 19-year-old who planned a murder, right? Therefore, there should not be a permanent stain, the taboo of being a convict or for the rest of your life. That shouldn't deny you college, that shouldn't deny you a job when you want to go past it and want to reform. Therefore, we argue it's best for everyone if rehabilitation is focused upon. Moving on to my second argument. Why they said a dangerous business? State action saying that we need to reduce standards for criminal liability can be viewed upon in two ways. First, why stop here? Keep reducing the age of consent, keep reducing standards of criminal justice, just get rid of intent, because what you're seeming to indicate is that as long as you commit the act, you don't really need intent, because that's exactly what you're doing by reducing the age to 13 years. So keep reducing standards of criminal justice. Why do you stop here? Second, this essentially politicizes criminal justice. When you want to reduce standards, say when you're a politician for some narrow ends, you want to reduce standards, you just have to cite this precedent. Hey, we did it then, why not now? And that's the dangerous slippery slope that you set up on side proposition, right? Moving on to my third constructive argument. Why is this particularly dangerous for drug-related offences? I'll take it.
So why are juveniles more deterred on your side to re-offend when punishments for their heinous crimes are just trivial and a slap on the wrist?
First of all, oftentimes when you're committing heinous crimes, not a slap on the wrist, you actually go to juvenile schools, you go to places where you get therapy, where you are not only provided training for you to rehabilitate, but at the same time are also provided the ability not only provided the ability to rehabilitate, but also provided training to make your life significantly better. So, you can't just win this debate using one or two examples where juveniles committed heinous crimes. This is about the thousands and thousands of other juveniles who committed simple non-violent crimes. Moving on to my final argument, dangerous for specifically drug-related offences. This is the age of the war against drugs. There are adults who are serving life sentences for committing non-violent, simplistic crimes in a hope to deter crime, in a hope to deter drugs. What you're going to do here, when you introduce these same screwed up principles for justice about drug crimes to teenagers, like 16-year-olds who just wanted to try weed in the US are now going to go to prison. And this, you're going to go to prison for 23 years till some good president gives you an amnesty. We tell you you're essentially unjust and morally bankrupt. And that's why we choose to oppose.
The second speaker for the proposition today. As our first speaker already told you, these crimes that take place between children are usually directed against children. So let me paint an image to you today. A 14-year-old is walking in the street. His friend, or at least an associate, walks up to him because of peer pressure, because of rivalry, or because of any reason, takes his life away. Are you going to tell me that that child does not deserve justice? Are you going to tell me today that just because the motive of a child was peer pressure and not murder, but the intent was to kill, that child is not culpable of murder in the first degree? The fact remains that because of this, because of our policy today, because we're not allowing children, because we're not allowed for the incarceration of trying children as adults, there is a great miscarriage of justice because individuals and victims are not getting the justice they deserve. Today, as the second speaker, I'm going to present to you a few points of refutation with the arguments of the opposition, and then talk to you about two things. Firstly, how this creates a better incentive for better parenting, and secondly, how this increases the faith in the judicial system and how that's great on society. But before we begin, let us talk about some things, right? So Hemant spoke to you today that you're going to ruin, no thank you sir, that you're going to ruin these lives of 14-year-olds because they're committing small petty crimes. But we argue to you that non-violent crimes like vandalism and theft do not actually reciprocate with 20-year prison sentences. They are trying to make it sound like because a kid just committed a crime of vandalism, he's going to be in jail for the rest of his life. That is not how these cases go down in history. The fact is that in cases like these are usually specific, these cases like these are not ones in which you go to prison. These are not cases where you go into some rehabilitation process, but there is a crime or a punishment or a fee that is levied against you for both adults and children. So the similar policy will continue. No, thank you, sir. It's not fair for them to assume that a child will somehow go to jail for vandalism, but an adult won't, because that's not how adults are treated when there such cases happen to them. The second thing, they argue to you that the harm done by a child is not intended to harm you that much. But we argue to you that the harm done to a victim is the same. Irrespective of your age, if your daughter is hurt, if your child is murdered on the streets, the harm to you is the same. It does not matter whether they were 40, whether they were 50, or whether they were 12. The fact is, the damage on your lives is the very same, to the same extent, and this is what we're fighting for today. Finally, they argue to you that somehow we're going to, they argue to you that there's no proportionality that exists. Let us realize 18 is also a teenager, 19 is also a teenager, and so are these 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds. The proportionality that exists for an 18-year-old should also exist for this 15-year-old, because just because I play Call of Duty and tomorrow say, let me storm the streets with my guns, does not make it justifiable for me to get away with a 3-month sentence when a 19-year-old would be in jail, rightfully so, for committing such atrocities. The fact is that these atrocities need to be addressed. Not once have they shown us how the judicial system is being fair to the victims, not once have they shown us, and it is a burden on them now to show to us why these victims should go through such a miscarriage of justice. Finally, as they themselves pointed out, it's a technicality that these are 18-year-olds and 17-year-olds. A victim should not suffer because of a technicality. We would rather that perpetrators of crime suffer because of a technicality than victims suffer because of a technicality, which is exactly what the opposition is arguing for today. So let us continue. What are we looking at here? We've already shown you how 18 is an arbitrary number. It is also a teenager, and a 17-year-old, 6-month child can commit the crime with the same intent, with the same motive, and to the same harm as an 18-year-old. We've also spoken to you how this
information,
I'll take you in a moment, sir. And we've shown to you why this is a deterrent. Now I'll talk to you about how parents have a better incentive. But you were
would the 12-year-old, 11-month-old child also not be equally liable to commit the crime as a 13-year-old? So is the arbitrary numbers just being reduced and not eliminated?
Thank you, sir. Let us understand two things. A 13-year-old does not commit the same number of violent crimes like murder as a 17-year-old. We do not see empirical data which shows 13-year-olds as perpetrators of such massive atrocities. We do see data which says 17-year-olds are committing such atrocities. And so we are fine with a 11-month-old child going scot-free because we assume that 13-year-olds are less likely because of data to commit such crimes. The fact is the people who are committing these crimes are usually in a bracket around 16, around 17, and these are the people who are going away scot-free. So now let me talk about how parents have a greater interest to be involved in parenting. A parent loves their child. I think that's an assumption that can be safely made in most instances. However, what we see is that in a lot of cases, these individuals who carry crimes in an age are because of negligent parenting. An example, in India, a child whose parents did not care went ahead and stabbed their teacher. The parents did not make a fuss about it, and that child is back on the streets right now. The fact is, because he was 17-year-old, he could get away. No, thank you, sir, with such a horrible crime. The fact is that because of such a great state, because parents now have an understanding that the consequences of their teenage child is as consequential as that of any child of theirs, they will have a greater stake and a greater role to play in their childhood. They would want to ensure that they work actively against proposing themes of violence, to actively work towards ensuring equality. The fact is, in a lot of cases, parents can shrug it off. Thank you, sir. Because parents can shrug it off because they're like, worst case scenario, it's not going to be that bad. We don't want that mentality to exist because we think that mentality is regressive and harmful to our society. By eliminating this mentality, we are actively working towards making society better, where parents are more engaged and more directly engaged towards tackling issues and making sure that their children are approaching life in a more safer, in a more civil, and in a more legal manner. Because when children think that they can get away with crime, we think that that is something that we should not be standing for. The second argument that I'll be making to you, the faith in the criminal judicial system. In India, actually I'll take you, sir.
Will you also reduce the drinking age to 13 because now they also have equal maturity?
No, sir. We will not do that because, as our first speaker already showed you, there is a balance of rights in this equation. The fact is, we are only reducing this age so that victims who are suffering a miscarriage of justice are now not suffering a miscarriage of justice. We are not saying that we think 13-year-olds won't and can drink, because we think that that is something that is different from this. We are saying that the reduction of this age is to ensure that there isn't a miscarriage of justice, something that we have been addressing constantly in two speeches, which does need a response from the opposition. But moving on to the faith in the criminal justice system. What did we see in the outbreak of Nirbhaya? We saw people taking onto the streets and demanding that a 17-year-old should face the same consequences. And what is the outcome of that? Today we have a law that safely allows victims to go through a proper judicial carriage, because now 16-year-olds are tried as adults. We see that this is a movement that is not arbitrary in nature, but something that we are already addressing in various parts of the world. In India, we have now changed. We have understood that it is not fair for victims to suffer such atrocities simply because of a number that does not define who you are. The second thing that we argue to you today is that there is now more faith in this system because they know that they're going to receive justice. The message that goes out is that crimes of these magnitude, crimes of such atrocity will no longer be tolerated by our country irrespective of the situation because these are individuals that deserve justice. The fact is we're going to move away from a society that is being tolerable in some aspects and move to a society that tells you that these are not going to be tolerated, that we need to actively work against this, and therefore general people are going to be deterred because of such a sensational change. The fact is when Nirbhaya rape case came and we realized that our children are equally harmful and that
30 more seconds.
Alright, ma'am, and that they can equally be guilty of such crimes, there was a sensational change. There was a greater spread of understanding of equality. There was a greater spread in understanding the need for respect of all genders and of all stratas of society. These sensational changes allow for a society to evolve because of a recognition of a fact that is extremely important. So at the end of the day, we say one thing. Justice needs to prevail and age is simply a number. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Introduce yourself.
My name is Loxley. I am the second speaker for the opposition team against the case that teenagers should be punished as adults. Today, courts across the world have seen criminal offenses ranging from petty theft all the way to murder and rape being committed by teenagers, those under 18. And yet, they are rehabilitated and given shortened sentences, and in the case of major offenses, they get new identities. Why would the courts need to do that? What does the court see that my proposition team is unable to see in these teenagers that have committed criminal offenses? They see a possibility of redemption. They see a case where they can improve themselves and improve their lifestyle and improve a chance of making it well in the society. Taking the right to live in a wonderful society and provide just because of one offense can often hurt the future of the child and everyone who he is related to and everyone who is dependent on him. Look at his parents. Are you telling me to, as much as the parents of a victim of a theft or major crimes will suffer, don't you think for a moment that the parents of the offender will suffer, not as much but to a great extent, knowing that the child, in a country like India, the child has brought shame upon the family, and that's an embarrassment. Or the fact that the mother has carried the same child 9 months in her womb just to see him suffer like this outside because of an offense that he cannot come back from, because of a sentence that has been put on his head that cannot be reversible, that will affect his future as a productive member of society. I want to tell a story right now. On May 1st, my grandfather left my house to go to the distant town of Vellore.
On that point, sir.
Denied. I'm telling a story. It's denied. My grandfather left to be able to go back to his hometown and set some priorities straight. The usual, paying off the rent, paying off the EB. Most people do that every day. And yet, however, on the morning, 8:30, May 2nd, my mother, while going to office, receives a phone call from a stranger, no doubt, who grabbed upon my grandfather's phone and said, he's been in a terrible accident that day. This was, by the way, 2 weeks ago. A week ago? Yes, a week ago. And 2 weeks ago. And he's been in a terrible accident. He's been admitted in the hospital. Please come and see him. And after going through all the processes of getting him into a nice hospital, getting him safe, making sure he's on a road to recovery, she learns from the police that the offenders were two youngsters, 16 and 17 respectively, who crashed into the bike after taking a wrong lane. And it resulted in him getting a hemorrhage in his head, not to mention bleeding from his ear and leakage of brain fluid because his skull was cracked. For a moment, my mother was angry, livid, absolutely horrified how two little boys can do such a horrible thing. Then she noticed for a second that these are two boys, two youngsters who are still living in cooperation with their parents, and she looked upon it for a second to see the emotion of the mothers of the children, the fathers of the children, and how they will suffer alongside the child if they were to really receive such a severe criminal punishment for not only being underage driving, but
On that
actually
point,
committed- not accepted. And not only being underage driver, but also committing a road accident, which resulted in an old man being unable, a road man suffering through such a long recovery period. By the way, my grandfather is fine. So thank you for asking.
On that point, sir.
Denied. So are you telling me today, proposition, that my mother's judgment is wrong? Are you telling me that maybe what my mother can see as an adult who can make proper decisions, what my mother can see in scope and future and talent for those two youngsters, and what the police further accepted and gave lenient punishments that gave them an insight into how hurtful it can be, and corrected these youngsters who are today going back to school to ascend to society? So are you telling me my mother's judgment is wrong in this scenario, and what that further actions she did to make sure these youngsters were back on the right track was wrong?
On that point, sir.
Denied. And now I want to go into a little bit of a biology class. I'm sorry for those of you who hate classes as we speak, despite being in a debate competition which is supposed to be fun and nice. Denied. Teenagers are more prone to erratic behaviors from adults. Why? Because of two little things I want to talk about in the brain. The brain that we all consider holy and the master of the body. And what is being used, or in the case of the proposition, not being used to aid them in this debate. The amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, let me sum it up for you. It makes decisions. It gives judgment, good and bad. The amygdala, it reacts to emotion. It will show you fear, the flight or fight syndrome. And when shown items that invoke fear, the adults, both the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, work efficiently, whereas on the teens, only the amygdala work, because it is scientifically proven that the prefrontal cortex, which makes decisions based on consequences in the future, is not developed. They are unable to see they are not unable, but very hazed view of what the consequences of their current actions can be. And this is a major factor into seeing whether they are able to see what they are actually doing.
On that point, sir.
Proceed.
So do you believe that if, as his child turns 18, all of a sudden his prefrontal cortex becomes completely efficient and now he can completely make rational decisions, which a 17-year-old could not do?
The arbitrary age that you proclaim is debated upon even till this date. And due to pressure, it used to be actually 25, because 25 was the maximum required for adults, for teenagers to be tried as adults. But as society has progressed, this number has reduced from 25 to 18. And let me tell you why. Because today's society has worked so efficiently as to make these teenagers capable of reaching this attainment of adulthood, only the attainment of adulthood at 18 or 19, 20. This is an arbitrary age. This is not an arbitrary precise point. This is a range of which society has taken the lower point, 18. To further go on to my points, criminal offenses committed by children, our surveys show that 20% happens out of direct decision by the young
30
juvenile
seconds
himself.
more. 30 seconds more.
Oh. 40% is influenced by outsiders, often adults, who force these children into doing it. And 40% out of self-defense or accidental. Are you going to persecute a child who is defending his mother, who murdered his father, just because the father, but not persecuting because his father was at the time choking his mother, sexually harassing her? Are you going to tell him, regardless of what happens, you are still a murderer and you still need to go to jail? But at the end of the day, he was when he was protecting his mother's dignity. And I tell to you that many criminal offenses are committed, but that does
Time
not
out.
mean that teenagers are to blame for all of them. Thank you.
Time.
Suni from Chennai. Third speaker is proposition. Can I start? Okay. It's quite funny. The team opposition characterizes us as destroying the lives of thousands of teenagers by sending them to prison because of taboo, not giving them access to education. But when it came to their characterization, all crimes the teenagers committed were crimes like vandalism and thefts, crimes that even adults don't go to prison for, crimes that aren't faced with that severe a sentence as the other violent crimes the team opposition has just conveniently ignored, because according to them, in their characterization, teenagers aren't committing those sort of crimes. So either A, they agree with us that we are not destroying the lives of these thousands of teenagers because we're not sending them to prison, or they agree with us that these teens that we are talking about who commit these heinous crimes should be punished and imprisoned. If the only characterization they're talking about, if the only teenagers who shouldn't be punished are the teenagers who only commit crimes like vandalism and theft, who aren't punished in the status quo anyway. So on team proposition, we argue to you that age is just a number and there is a reason why teenagers should be prosecuted for such criminal offences. So as the third speaker, this debate came down to 3 essential questions. A, of 1. Do these victims of heinous crimes deserve redressal? 2. Which side effectively ensures that teenagers are deterred from reoffending? And 3. Which side ensures that the state and parents are becoming more responsible and take more responsible decisions on behalf of these teenagers? So moving on to my first question. No, thank you, sir. Do these victims of heinous crimes deserve redressal? When we told them about the kinds of heinous crimes we were definitively talking about, the kinds of heinous crimes we were definitively going to prosecute teenagers for, the kinds that they're likely to go to prison for, like the kinds of rape, murder, domestic abuse, sexual assault, incredibly aggravated battery, all of those sort of crimes, they had no response to it at all. Because according to them, teenagers are only capable of committing these smaller crimes like vandalism and theft for the thrill of it. So we argue to you that if that was the case, and they specifically told us that we're ruining the lives of thousands of teenagers because we're putting an official mark on their permanent record as the criminal. We argue to you that society does not look as a thief and a rapist in the same eyes. We do not consider them to be crimes of similar magnitude, and therefore the lives aren't going to be as dramatically altered as you argue, especially if these children or teenagers aren't going to be punished anyway. And they told us that we have to be sympathetic because of the irreversible outcomes of our decision. We argue to you, what about the irreversible outcome of their actions in the first place? They have destroyed the lives of other children, of other teenagers, whom on this side of the house we are effectively protecting, but they do not care about. And we argue to you that when such teenagers, they know what they're doing, they know about these actions and their consequences, because it is quite unreasonable for them to argue that it is only at 18 that they have true understanding of their actions. We think that is just an arbitrary distinction, and that biologically also that is not necessarily the case. But even thank you, sir. But even if it is the case, we argue to you that it is still important that we ensure that these teenagers do not have the right to go around committing these crimes furthermore, which I will prove to you how we do not deter them from doing on their side of the house. When we brought that up, they had no response to that either. We give you the example of the United Kingdom, where such a system exists, where teenagers of 14 years and above are already prosecuted for crimes for criminal offences as adults. And we argue to you that in countries like the UK, the reoffence rates amongst these teenagers are far less than in countries where teenagers are immediately sent to prison. And when they told us about how these we already have this arbitrary distinction of 18 for other rights, we argue to you that this is very, very different from those other rights, because those other rights affect you as an individual, and those are based on your choices and your right to self-determine what happens to you. But in this case, this isn't a balance of the rights, because we aren't acknowledging the rights of the victim, the family of the victims. Victims have the right to redressal, have the right to live with dignity, have the right to life, which these teenagers essentially deprive them of. So secondly, moving on to which side effectively ensures that teenagers are deterred from reoffending. But before I do so, I'll take you.
Yeah. Your whole argument, you mentioned quite clearly that you don't care so much about these vandalism and these low-scale kind of crimes. You care about rape, murder, aggravated battery, etc. And Chaitanya, I think, conceded that these don't happen at an age around 13. They're around the 16-18 bracket. So then why don't you define the arbitrary age or whatever as 15 instead of 13?
Amongst 13-year-olds won't be convicted for these crimes. So the distinction that we're making, if you agree with us that 13-year-olds aren't committing crimes, then that this particular clause in the penal code doesn't make a difference on either side, because 13-year-olds aren't committing crimes, so they aren't going to jail. Nothing's going to happen to them. It's just that we deter them effectively because this sends out a message that the state sends that they aren't going to tolerate this crime no matter who does it or at what age they do it. And that's exactly the point we're trying to make. This also depends on the message that the state sends out, and it's a much more impactful message when the state sends this message out. But secondly, about their entire thing, that teenagers have a unique scope for rehabilitation. We agree. Teenagers do have a unique scope for rehabilitation. That is precisely why, in our first speech, we mentioned that teenagers will be sent to young prisons where they aren't going to be subjected to that violent environment. No, thank you, sir. That otherwise makes them incredibly hostile to the state in general. And we argue to you that on your side of the house, your idea of rehabilitation is to slap them on the wrist, say, 3 months you stay in this juvenile home, and then you walk around scot-free doing whatever you want without actually feeling regretful about your actions. But on our side of the house, we argue to you that we are genuinely deterring them because they're paying the price for their actions, but are not paying in such a manner that deprives them of an opportunity to be able to live a meaningful life after, but we're rather letting them actually regret their actions and make sure we convert them into valuable law-abiding citizens in the future. Obviously, if we wouldn't want these children to become citizens, genuine law-abiding citizens in the future, we would just send them to these violent prisons that you talk about. Clearly, even the proposition does understand that. And secondly, you never had any response to us when we told you that 54% of teenagers who were sent to juvenile homes were reoffending after they were let out of these juvenile homes because they don't understand the consequences of their actions when they made trivial, and when the media victimizes them and says, oh, they're just children, they couldn't have possibly meant to do this, which is not the case. And when they told us that their only motive is the thrill and the peer pressure, we argue to you that such factors shouldn't be the factors that drives anybody to commit crime. And if it does drive them to commit crime, they should be curbed, and this is the best way for us to do it. And peer pressure happens on their side of the house when they're adults anyway, and clearly since you don't bother about that sort of peer pressure, you have to tell us why this is distinct. And secondly, they told us about this child who happened to kill his father because he was choking his mother. That is not even a crime. He won't be convicted in a court of law for doing that because defense of others is not a crime. Self-defense is not a crime. He's not going to jail. He is not going to have any permanent mark. He will be acquitted. He will not be guilty. And therefore, this is not in the scope of this debate. And lastly, which side ensures that the state and no, thank you, protected time, sir. Parents and state take more responsible decisions. We told you that the message that state sends us is the most important thing here, where the state says it's going to be intolerant of these heinous offences no matter what, and they're going to make sure they take the strictest action possible for these things. That is why people will have an increased faith in the criminal justice system, where they will believe that the criminal justice system responds to all of their grievances on the same level. And secondly, when they spoke to us about these parents and the background that these children come that drives them to crime, we argue to you that we agree that this background of these children drives them to these crimes, but that is precisely why we need this policy, because that's when parents have an incentive to change how they raise their children up, to change their background.
Okay. One thing, right? What are the dual aims of justice? It's very simple. You have retribution, you have rehabilitation. Proposition has talked a lot about rehabilitation and how they view that their proposed policy is going to increase rehabilitation. And I'll argue against them on that. But first, let me focus on one thing which I think no one in this debate has brought up at all, which is retribution. Right? What they want, when you move from a system which prosecutes children as children and move them to a system where you prosecute them as adults, the scope of retribution increases. And today I'm telling you why morally that is increasing retribution for children is something which does not make sense on a moral level. And why is that? When you do something wrong, what's accountable for that? It's your own flawed moral system, right? You chose a wrong path. You did not have the wisdom or the knowledge or the information to take the correct decision, and you chose to violate the laws of society. My argument here is that a 13-year-old does not have, no thank you ma'am, does not have the kind of information, does not have the kind of awareness, does not have the moral system to make the correct decision. And even if he does have the moral system is not something he formed himself. Because you form your own moral system when you are free to take your own decisions. And a child who is not free to make his own decisions is disproportionately influenced in his morals by his parents. No, thank you, sir. And when he is influenced by his parents, the actions he takes as a teenager, when he has just moved out of childhood, when he's just moved out of a mollycoddled childhood and is making the first actual decisions of his life, no thank you ma'am, then at that point, to expect him to make some mistakes is reasonable. To tell him that no, he is supposed to have everything right from the get-go, he is supposed to have a perfectly sound moral system which will tell him and guide him absolutely correctly, that is something you cannot expect. Chaitanya in his own anecdote stated that someone, a teenager, can, out of sheer peer pressure, can murder someone. And I think that's a wonderful argument for us to make. Because when you have a child who can actually be so susceptible to peer pressure that peer pressure can actually lead to him committing murder, then the child is anyway so fragile and so devoid of any kind of moral system of his own that whatever actions that he is doing himself, he is not actually culpable for, because they are just the product of the society into which.
On that point, sir.
Okay, sir, I'll take your point.
How is it different when a 17-year-old is backed by peer pressure and commits murder and an 18-year-old is backed by peer pressure and commits murder? How are you differentiating between the two crimes?
Absolutely, sir. So the argument here is not about differentiating between a 17-year-old who's backed by peer pressure and commits murder and an 18-year-old who's backed by peer pressure and commits murder. The fact is that, yes, so we set the maximum possible limit in the sense that, yeah, at one point you do have to tell society that at this point we do expect you to finally have developed that moral system. And it's true, right? Some people will develop it at 14, some people will develop it in 15, some people will develop it at 17, and most of them will develop it by 18. And even if there are some who don't develop it by 18, then yes, that portion is so minute and insignificant that we ignore them. And when we make any decision on a broad societal level, of course, no decision can be completely infallible and completely perfect. No, thank you, ma'am. Another argument I've been trying to make, their whole argument is about deterrence, right? How instituting these new punishments will lead to deterrence in the sense that teenagers would not want to commit more crimes and their parents will be more inspired to prevent them from committing crimes. This is, I think, a really flawed argument because it ignores human psychology. Let me explain. The kind of children who are committing crimes and the kind of parents they have, those parents are not the kind of parents who actually even give a damn about their children. So those parents are not going to end up making a difference in their parenting if they are told that tomorrow your child will go to jail versus tomorrow your child will go to a justice home. A good parent, no thank you sir, a good parent will be equally concerned about his child going to a criminal justice home as he will be about his child going to jail. And a good child will be equally concerned about going to a criminal justice home and going to jail. So when you're talking about extremes like these, when you're talking about the section of society which doesn't care anyway, they're anyways uninformed, they have no idea what consequences their actions have. So changing those consequences will not change their actions and thus there will be no deterrence on the sort of. Yes sir.
So your second speaker literally said that the parents of a criminal are the ones that you should be caring about and worrying about. Can you explain why there's been this huge change in your opposition stand about who the victims are and whom you should be caring about?
Okay, so of course the proposition was talking about one set of examples in which you do have a parent who is caring, but I'm also telling you at the same time that that is not always the case. He did not say in his argument that you will always only have parents who are feeling sad about this. And another argument which I'd like to make about their entire point is this entire concept of redressal. No thank you ma'am. You are talking about redressal and talking about how the victims deserve this justice. And you are somehow equated this justice of the victims with the punishment of the criminal, and that is a psychological equation which I don't think is completely correct. Why? Because
on
yes,
that point,
you will
sir.
have, no thank you sir, you will have some victims of a certain type of crime who will feel that the only way they can be compensated for is to see the person who perpetrated that crime go to jail. On the other hand, you will also have a certain set of victims of a certain kind of crime who will say that no, we understand, we appreciate the sociological circumstances from which that perpetrator of the crime came, and we understand that we do not want to just punish them, and just punishment will not give us any benefit. You talked about committing irreversible crimes, irreversible damage. Yes, that damage is irreversible. So some kind of compensation, this concept of redressal is not equal to the concept of retribution, and that's another argument they made which I have a huge problem with. Then moving on, we've all had this large conversation about slap on the wrist. they seem to think that the current system is very much a slap on the wrist. It's completely inconsequential. You go to a justice home, it's a very rosy outcome. It's all 4 years of psychological counseling and wondrous playing around in just, normal childhood. And this is not a deterrent for crime. So they haven't ever been to a childhood justice home. It might sound very wonderful and lovely in theory, but the fact is that on the ground realities, childhood justice homes are also like adolescent prisons only. They are conditions where you constantly see reports of all kinds of violations of children's rights, all sorts of violations of basic amenity. You don't have the kind of access to regular facilities which anyone else has. So the fact is that no one will want to go back to those conditions. So the argument that the status quo punishment is insufficient, especially because the people you're punishing here are not adults but children, that argument also falls completely. Then lastly, you've also brought up this entire point about recidivism.
30 seconds more.
In the context that how recidivism there's a very high rate of recidivism amongst teenage offenders. Well, the fact is that recidivism is also very high in general. So that's a problem systemically with criminal justice, not just with criminal justice for children. So on the whole of this, I can say that all the arguments they made have been sort of misleading, have been sort of misguiding us entirely, and I am very, very proud to propose. Thank you so much.
Now a sum up by the opposition.
To drink. He says no, but here's a balance of rights in this situation. So what it essentially means is that 13-year-olds are not culpable, but as a state we need revenge, we need retribution, so we are sentencing them to prison. In a debate of principle, their case has been argued on a technicality, and the only principle they ever gave was one of retribution and revenge. Criminal justice systems cannot be based on the personal whims of victims. As much as we feel our sympathies for these victims, as much as we are sorry for them, criminal justice systems have to have functional legal principles, and that is what we support on side opposition. When we argue to you about the reckless mind of a teenager and why that doesn't constitute to intent, no response. When we argue to you about rehabilitation and when we gave you the comparative as to what it looked in two situations right from my first speech, no response. When we talk to you about how drug-related crimes were already ramped up, already had like life sentences which are like clearly not proportional, and how they're going to apply those same very bad policies to teenagers, no response. When we argue to you about a precedent that it sets and how it's dangerous, given that you're constantly reducing, that this creates a way to constantly reduce standards for criminal justice, no response. This debate came down to two clashes. First, legitimacy, and second, who best ensures a future for the on grounds of rehabilitation. We argue to you that intent is not valid, right? That you have to judge based on legal principles, not revenge. And to all of this, they kept rambling about this balance of rights, which in reality, which in a simple rephrasing is retribution. The second thing they did in this debate was to mischaracterize the thousands of crimes that teenagers commit and make this entire debate about one or two sensational crimes that happened. This debate is not just about a Nirbhaya, but about 13-year-olds who do simple crimes but have a permanent stain on their record. This is about removing any scope for rehabilitation that exists. And then they kept rambling about this thing too. They said that our age was arbitrary. We already set up in our very first speech as to how, we also gave you in our second speech some complex biology as to why it starts at 18, but we also told you how, generally it is convention that 18-year-olds reach the maturity to make decisions and to have active choices. And they kept saying that it's arbitrary, that why 17 years and 12 months is any different. The thing is, not only can't they win this on a technicality, even if this age was indeed arbitrary, you have to put a limit somewhere. You have to have some basic standards as to what constitutes intent. And that can't be 13 years old when you're still not even in high school yet. Second point, rehabilitation. Their entire case for rehabilitation was based on this one model point about separate prisons. Given the state of underfunding to prisons, given the lack of political capital to improve prisons, even if we do assume that they can actually manage to change the jails and create a new jail,
30
do they
seconds
change
more.
abusive wardens? Do they change apathetic corrupt politicians who let prisons rot and let them be underfunded? Do they change constant disease outbreaks, rampant drug usage, violence in prisons? No. We argue to you that you have to become a criminal and then go to prison. On side proposition, you go to prison and come out as criminals. We oppose.
It is a world where they were happy to criticize us by saying that we will destroy the lives of thousands of teenagers by sending them to prison for so many years, while at the same time only defend the teenagers who vandalize, who won't be sent to prison even if they were an adult in the first place. By the second speaker, they were telling us how their prefrontal cortex will magically develop at the age of 18 and everyone will become perfectly rational at that magic number. But their third speaker asserted and confessed to the fact that it is different for individual cases, that some people develop it earlier, some people develop it later, enhancing our argument that they shouldn't be let away on that technicality. And finally, they told us in their second speech that these parents of these people who are committing these crimes are victims and we need to stop taking them away from their parents. By their third speaker, they told us that these parents don't care about these children, so the best way to treat these children is to send them back to those negligent parents and ask them to continue committing these crimes over and over again. Because our world is the world that actually ensures that we create redressal for victims. Our world is the world that actually creates incentive to deterrence and actually creates rehabilitation. We are proud to propose in this motion. Two questions that I want to ask in today's debate. So firstly, I want to compare the rights of the victims and the rights of the perpetrators. And secondly, I want to ask which side better reduces the rates of reoffense and leads to better rehabilitation. So from the very beginning of this debate, we told you that the major stakeholder in this debate are the victims, right? The victims who have suffered heinous crimes. The victims who have a genuine right to redressal. We told you from the beginning of this debate that the criminal justice system is based on a foundation of redressal to victims and punishment of perpetrators. And we told you that the intent of a person who is a teenager is no different from the intent of a person who's above the age of 18, right? Because they completely confuse what intent means, right? So by intent we mean, does that person actually want to kill that person, or did he accidentally kill that person? We don't mean, did that person do it for peer pressure, or did he do it because he wanted to cold-bloodedly murder someone? Culpability is based on the intent of whether you wanted to commit that crime. We don't think it changes based on your age. And they wanted to make this argument by their second speech that your prefrontal cortex develops as a magic number, and therefore at the age of 18 you're perfectly rational and can make any of those decisions. We told you first of all that is a lie, right? That difference on individual case, that some people develop it earlier, some people develop it later. We told you that only strengthens our argument that we need to ensure that these people don't get away simply based on a technicality. No response from their side of the house. Furthermore, right, we told you the unique harms of victimizing the perpetrators of these crimes. We told you the unique harms of the media treating the people who committed these crimes as the people in the victims of this case, as opposed to the real victims in this problem. We told you that these are the people who we are irreversibly damaging by telling them that it's okay if they commit crimes because they're going to be treated as children, they're going to be given a slap on the wrist, nothing will happen to them. Moving on to my second question, on which side do we see lower rates of reoffense, and which side do we better lead to rehabilitation? So firstly, we told you from the very beginning we have better deterrence on our side of the house, which is why we think that you have lower rates of recidivism. We showed you how in other countries where you have 54% as the rate of recidivism among juveniles, whereas in the UK where this policy is implemented, it was only 36%. No response from their side of the house. But also, right, they again at the point of parents, right, they flip-flop by the third speaker will take that. Let's take the stance that the final speaker gave. The final speaker said these parents don't care about their children. So we think that negligence is a problem in and of itself.
30
we should
seconds
take them
more.
away from these parents who don't want to treat their children, who want to continue ensuring these children commit crimes. We think it's perfectly acceptable for state to put them in a center where they can actually rehabilitate, as opposed to with parents who simply don't care. And furthermore, right, we told you that only the specific reasons why putting them in a juvenile center is why they're going to rehabilitate. We told you firstly that only putting them in a confined means that they have the ability to rehabilitate and reflect on their crime. No response. We told you that all of their problems such as violence and drugs and all of those are solved by creating a separate prison. No response.
Time up.
And because of all these reasons, we tell you that justice should prevail because age is just a number we propose.
Thank you.